nine, eight, seven, six, five, four, three, two, one.
Welcome everyone to the online panel on remote online education for the Newchip Accelerator Global Program. We look forward to talking about an issue that's very relevant during this time. In the United States, an estimated 50 million students are being left at home due to schools shutting down. And this impacts not only them, but their education, but also educators and parents. And as a mother of two young boys, I am personally interested in this issue. And as I also have an ed tech company, I'm professionally as well. So I'm very eager to hear from the expertise of our four panelists today. First, we have Jeff Ervine, CEO of Bridg-It and a former hedge fund manager in New York City. Secondly, we have Ivey, CEO of Common Coach and former Dean of Admissions at the University of Chicago. We also have Manoj Fernando, CEO of EDDI.AI, an instructor in a master's program at Harrisburg University. And last but not least, we have Maxwell Witt, CEO of Integrate, an e-learning platform. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. If it's okay, I'd love for you to introduce yourself and a little bit about your ventures to our audience. So Jeff, do you mind going first?
Yes, thank you, Tina. Welcome. Hi, I'm Jeff Ervine. I'm the founder and creator of Bridg-It Positive Social Networks. My background is I was on Wall Street for about 20 years and I ran a lot of hedge funds and I looked at the behavior of the market. I had an incident in 2008 where I got attacked online, lost my reputation, had to go to court for 4 years to protect my identity, won a case against Google, got everything taken down. And along the way, I became an expert in defamation per se, online learning, and social emotional learning. And after going through that experience, I never wanted to have anyone else go through the same experience that I went through. Unfortunately, it does. So we created Bridg-It, which is a positive social network, which teaches kids how to connect using positivity and kindness. They practice it every day. And by doing so, we stave off unconscious bias. And we really drive diversity because we force the students to connect and create healthy relationships. So very excited to be here today.
Thanks, Jeff. We're happy to hear from you about social emotional learning as well. Anna, love to hear from you.
Yeah, so as you know, I come from the admissions world and higher education, and I have always wondered why there wasn't something like TurboTax, but for the college application, meaning you're a motivated digital native and you have to DIY some portion or maybe all of your college application. And where's this tool that helps you through the whole application with the benefit of expert advice? So we created that and we're basically solving that last mile problem. And what I mean by that is that students have all kinds of great tools right up until they actually do the application. So there are all these great tools that help them find colleges that are good fits for them, scholarship search tools. Their high schools have all kinds of great tools to help them manage the recommendations process or the transcript processing. But there was just nothing out there to help a student who's sitting in front of a browser looking at their online college applications. So we offer strategic advice for every question, every essay in the college application. As I say, it's a last mile problem. And it was sort of the one big hole in the middle of that donut that hadn't been filled yet.
Thanks, Anna. Look forward to hearing more about it. And then Manoj, would love to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks, Tina. Hi, everyone. My name is Manoj Fernando. And one thing I will say is I currently have 2 teenage kids in high school. So they are in online learning. I'm also a professor at Harrisburg University of Science and Technology, where I teach online classes in their master's program. My current venture is a company called EDDI.AI, where we provide personalized career guidance to high school kids. Our goal is to basically identify the talent DNA of each and every single kid and be able to provide them with guidance in order to achieve their goals. So that could be through colleges, community colleges, vocational schools, or even certificate programs, right? The platform has all the relevant data relative to emerging jobs, financial data, career growth, job growth, and all that type of information to allow these kids to make potentially the right decision in guiding them along their career path. I've been in the tech industry for about 25 years, worked in both public and private companies for the past 17 years. I've been involved with startups. This is my sixth startup company. So I've been through the good, the bad, and the fun, I think, of startups in raising capital and going through the entire process and relative to growing a company from its infancy. For the last couple of years, I've been involved with a startup that provides innovation and education programs around the globe, primarily to South Korea, but it has also included countries like Chile, Brazil, Spain, and China. Currently, we are a part of the Newchip Accelerator program. We've been in there for about 2 months and kind of learning the way as to how things work outside Silicon Valley as well. So I'm thrilled to be here and glad to provide my opinion on online learning. Thanks.
Thanks, Manoj. And then Maxwell.
Thank you. My name is Maxwell Witt. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Integrate. We are a consolidated management tool for K-12 schools that use laptops in the classroom, and we are helping schools go remote, work in blended environments, and work from school when they can. My experience has been just as a student in high school and college, I had to use Blackboard, which is a learning management system, and myself and my peers, I had never heard of a person who really enjoyed using it, although it was known as the gold standard. And that's where I started to theorize on some of the problems of the education system. And basically from there, I went on to network at entrepreneurship events and conferences, looking to gain some more corporate experience, and was very fortunate to have met Gerard Adams, who was a serial entrepreneur angel investor. He became a mentor to me, and basically I wound up helping him build Founders Incubator in Newark, New Jersey. And I got the opportunity to mentor startups out of the space, helping me then get my credibility in pitching the idea to my co-founder, whom I met in college, Kevin Siliska.
Awesome. Well, I love hearing everyone's intro because everyone has a background in higher education or as a parent or a serial entrepreneur or in the financial industry in New York. And so I'm really eager for that multiple perspective as we kick off. So let's kick off. I'd love to hear what you think about the current state of online public education, especially with respect to startups in this whole COVID era. Jeff, would you like to go first?
I'll go first. Great. Right now, with respect to startups, given what's going on with the budgets, which are driving most of the decisions across America, and the fact that state taxes are down across the board, everyone's in a very defensive position, and public education especially is a very political environment. So there's not a lot of money. There's actually no money. When you start to look at it, 75% of the entire state budgets around education are for salaried teachers, and 25% is for the rest. So getting in right now, it's very, very hard. You have to have relationships or have something that's research-based that they absolutely need right now. And so for us, working on social emotional learning and driving connectedness and belonging and getting rid of loneliness, it's at a top priority right now. And that's how we've been able to continue to expand in this market.
Absolutely. Manoj, you mentioned that you have 2 teenagers at home. How are they handling right now?
Well, the one thing is, obviously this online school is a bit new to all of them, right? And at the end of the day, I look at them, I think the biggest thing that they're missing is the social aspect, right? Kind of the friends and hanging out with them and, from that perspective. So a lot of that, it's a huge thing. You see the way they interact with the screen, and it's kind of like boredom and, the cell phone is a distraction on the side, all these other things that go on. Relative to what from a startup perspective, one of the things that I have seen, and the school had a tough time figuring this out in the first 2 or 3 weeks, was security, right? So people were joining the classrooms, posting rude comments and things like that. And the school had a hard time. It was kind of a hodgepodge system trying to figure out security issues. So there were a lot of threatening messages and things like that that came across online. And the schools are trying various ways to prevent that outside interference from that standpoint. So it's been a bit of an interesting experience, and I guess it's kind of learn as you go or adapt as you go to some of the new platforms. So.
Yeah. Maxwell, what do you think about what Manoj had to say? Are you seeing that when you are working with schools as well?
Absolutely. What Manoj said was completely right. Schools were using kind of a bunch of different systems to kind of figure out how to run their environment efficiently, whether it's learning management systems, student information systems, engagement tools, basically all this toolkit. And the schools that I've seen and spoken to that have been the most successful are the ones that were able to translate to remote learning. And the systems that they've been using that I've seen is Google Classroom mixed with Zoom, is kind of like the core experience that I think most schools have been successful with. But what I've been hearing is these are just existing systems that were in place that were never meant to solve this problem. It doesn't 100% solve the problems. There are still difficulties with this, but it's kind of the best thing that there is now.
Absolutely. And then Anna, with your work at Common Coach, do you see some of the same issues with your schools and partners?
Yeah, certainly at the high schools for the school-based counseling programs. I mean, even before the pandemic, they were always being expected to do more with less. And now things, of course, are even harder than before, and they have no budgets. They're very upfront with me about that. Where we are fortunate, I suppose, is that by default, it's pretty easy for us to be B2C, meaning anyone can come to our website and download our tool. So students aren't necessarily dependent on their high schools to purchase this for the entire senior year class. But certainly I feel for those schools, I feel for the counselors, to the extent that everything is moving into the virtual world. We're hoping that our tool is only going to be able to support people as they are now doing their college applications in an entirely virtual counseling scenario.
Yeah, I think the common theme I'm hearing is that this COVID forced a lot of change suddenly in our schools. So everyone is trying to cope. So let's turn a little bit to current trends. So what are your thoughts on current trends and structural dynamics that are either promoting or hindering the adoption and further growth of online or remote learning in public education? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
So
Go ahead.
One of the things that I will say, and this is something that, especially in public schools, is basically the lack of access to equipment, right? So not everybody has a computer. And that's been a huge challenge because schools, even when in the spring, when they try to do it, they try to provide online learning, I think almost like 15 or 20% of the students didn't have access to equipment. So as a result of that, they actually couldn't do it because they couldn't provide equal access to a learning environment, right? So that's a big issue. Over the last 2 or 3 months, you've seen the schools kind of try to collect money and budgets and things like that so that they can actually donate or give kids, loan kids laptops and computers so that they can use that as online school for them to learn. So that's been a huge challenge from that standpoint. And just one other thing also, as I see my kids study, they're looking at the computer, but the phone is on the side, or they switch to the phone and they watch the Zoom recording on the phone for whatever reason they don't like the computer. So you're kind of seeing this mix and match of devices, and it's a way for them to skip through boredom as well, switching from a computer to a phone as well. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Engagement's a real issue, especially as we move online. Jeff, I think you were about to say something too.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different ways to look at this. And so if you look at it from a teacher's perspective, right? They're not used to teaching this way. They don't have the skill set. And for teachers to be successful with their students, they have to really connect with them. So a lot of teachers, it's a very in-person thing. And when you have their undivided attention, as Manoj was saying earlier, distraction destroys concentration, right? Every time. And the teachers aren't comfortable teaching online either. In the spring, only about 20 or 30% of the teachers actually were teaching. They were mostly just posting, and they were getting a free pass, whether it was in Florida or New York. So there was no real structure. And over the summer, some school districts did a lot of training with their teachers to work on their skill set as to teaching in a remote learning environment. Others, they're still fighting it out at the union levels. In New York City, they just delayed school until the 21st of September. And so that's from the teacher's perspective. From a student's perspective, some of the kids with disabilities have done great, right? Because they don't have the social threat around them. And or they're working more with their parents and getting more support. So there's a group of students who didn't get a lot of support from their students historically, where the parents are now engaged in doing it. And then there are the summer school students, which in New York City, only about 30 or 40% showed up. right? Those were the numbers. So there's an accountability issue that's going on. And yet remote learning is the default around the world right now, in terms of what's going on everywhere from China to France. So it's, you know, it's a new environment. It's a new context. You have to do it. You have to know how to do it. And we're all learning at the same time.
So I just want to ask a quick follow-up question to that. You know, given the unfortunate numbers you just gave in terms of students not showing up because it's online, right? And lack of engagement. What are some things that you're seeing in terms of trends that are helping overcome that? Or maybe some things that some of your school districts have done that actually try to mitigate some of these things we're saying? I'm just curious.
You want the sad reality, and the sad truth was in the spring, they were just trying to get to summer, right? They were just surviving through it. So it's too early to tell. With our platform, we did a lot of after-school online activities, right, through Zooms and sessions and group engagement activities. So when we put that out there to the schools, they really latched onto it to have fun, community-based engagement, because everyone's lonely and everyone wanted to see each other. So that's the direction we're heading in. Hopefully, they'll be able to do more and more of that, but it requires the leadership to really focus on putting new programs in place, again, without budgets, and they have to have the creativity, and they're all under stress. So it's you know, we're just going to lead as much as we can, but yeah, it's going to be a challenging environment.
Yeah.
So just to add to that, an unfortunate side effect that I've seen recently, one of the statistics was 15% of parents are pulling their students out of schools because they were not happy with the way that schools were transitioning to remote or how they were underprepared. Side note to that is a lot of parents, the responsibility fell on them to teach their kids how to use this new suite of tools or train them to use them. And if the parents were technologically unsavvy, that became just a huge mess. And that's exactly what led to all those problems in the education system of, you know, all those ineffective, you know, students that would not show up to class or just have a hard time with that transition to remote. And I think as a byproduct of that, now we're also seeing a lot of homeschooling and pod schooling, I believe, is this new trend where it's just groups of homeschooling.
Yeah.
Yep.
And unfortunately, the demarcation line between the haves and the have-nots is really socioeconomic. Yes. And so as you start to look at it, in New York City, I know that 42% of Asian parents who have a reputation, right, elected for homeschooling this year to start the year. So this is what's going on. And so every group is different. Every school is different. And so the biggest thing that we're not going to be able to do a really good job at, and this may be a blessing in the long term, is standardized testing. I personally would think it's the worst thing that we ever did and has hurt the students. So if we can take an opportunity on remote learning to engage more project-based learning, I think it will yield a much better, much more mature student as we move forward.
Yeah, no, thanks for your insight. And I know that you work with maybe perhaps a different group of students, so I'm curious as to your perspective on current trends and benefits or not great benefits of this move to online learning.
Yeah, so not only do high school students have to do their college applications online, which poses all the same access issues and just tech issues, but they also have to do all their testing online for colleges that require the ACT or the SAT. And that has been an absolute fiasco this year. And so increasingly colleges are going test optional, but not all have. And now the courts are involved as of yesterday here in California. The University of California is now, at least temporarily, prohibited from taking those tests into consideration at all. So all of that is in flux, but talk about adding even more stress to these students' lives. It's frankly inexcusable because this is still very much in the control of colleges. Colleges decide what their requirements are. And of course, students norm around that. So I hope to see more colleges going test optional or test blind, but not all have. And so it's still a very stressful situation for students who are applying to those kinds of colleges.
Absolutely. I think some of I've already alluded to it, but the move to either project-based learning or some kind of blended learning option being accelerated by COVID. I'm curious to hear what are some of your school partners doing, or you may be doing at home to facilitate this rapid movement of trying to coordinate in person and online, or some amalgamation of the two.
Can I just address it? Because New York City, I'll address it from this perspective. New York City is the only really blended learning where you're going a couple days a week and you're going to be learning from home. And pretty much everyone else has opted to start out on a remote learning basis across the country. And as I talk to our principals in New York City, they're like, this won't work, because blended learning can't work because there's not enough teachers. And all of a sudden, so you have a limiting constraint in the number of teachers, so that you can't maintain a blending learning environment. Also, X amount of the teachers, I think like 15 or 20,000 teachers in New York City got medical dispensations that they don't have to teach in the classroom. So now they're only going to be teaching remotely. So you're creating all these constraints around the limiting factor. It's kind of like flying aircraft and having pilots. You know, they time out, you lose time. So, you know, blended learning, we're gonna learn a lot in what can and can't be done in the next 6 months.
Absolutely, absolutely. I will say also, I mean, one thing that I'm seeing as a parent at home is the pressure on parents to be more involved in a way that we haven't before, even if we move to this blended learning approach. I'm curious, Manoj, if you're seeing that, or Max, well, if you're seeing that with your partners as well.
You know, in regards to blended learning, even here, right, in the school, from based on what I know right now, it's 100% remote learning, but I think within the next 2 months or so, they'll probably go to blended learning, because both my kids, and a little bit of my perspective on this, both my kids are heavily involved with high school sports and multiple sports, right? So one of the things that you're starting to see right now is little by little, they're opening it up to sports practices and things like that. So in some regards, in some aspects of it, they are being forced to kind of bring the students into the school to kind of interact with other students, and with masks or without masks and things like that. So as a result, kind of in some ways that blended learning is forced upon you, because it's kind of like going to school and then going over for practices. So there is some discussion of how to kind of blend the two together so that they keep the number of days of practice where you have education and sports kind of mixed up together, so that they can manage that on maybe 2 or 3 days a week as well. So that's been an interesting discussion over the last couple of weeks as to how they're planning on managing some of those things. So.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, it's really, I'm really curious, because traditionally blended learning was teaching in person, but then having asynchronous materials to do at home, right? But now when we talk about blended learning, you're talking about, well, sometimes you meet in person and then sometimes you don't. So I'm just curious how it's going to look post-COVID. I don't know if Anna or Maxwell, if you have any thoughts on that. What will blended learning actually look like in the future?
You know, I don't see it as necessarily a downside, and I think Jeff may have alluded to it previously, but there are plenty of students for whom the sort of in-person learning environment is not ideal for a variety of reasons. And so having this sort of home-based online option is actually a big improvement for them. And what I'm hoping is, when this is all behind us, is that we can do those kinds of customizations and we'll be more comfortable with them. And we can figure out on a kid-by-kid basis what the best learning environment is. And hopefully by then too, we'll all have mastered how to do the online delivery of education really well.
I think you said it best. It's all about figuring out how to master this big change and this overhaul. And then I think once we start figuring out how to do this on a larger scale for public schools, then I think post-COVID, things might stay the same. Actually, even today, I spoke to a school who's been remote and blended for the past 6 years. And they said that they had absolutely no problem with this transition, which of course, but it was just incredible to hear that they give the option to be remote and blended. And most students in their school chose to be remote completely. And apparently they've had a lot of success with this, and they've had to figure out the suite of tools that they needed to use early on for this. But I think it's just getting the rest of the country to really figure those out, what are the best ones, and even have some new innovations and software come in there and help support that trend as well.
Yeah, no, that's actually, oh, sorry, Manoj, go ahead.
I had a quick question. So is that a public or a private school?
I believe that was a private school.
But just one thing also, if you take a look at like Maxwell just mentioned, homeschooling has been quite successful for quite some time, right? So I happen to know a friend of mine whose wife is actually a teacher, and they just cannot handle the demand right now for homeschooling, right? They're just desperate for teachers and for those type of programs. There's a huge demand for homeschooling right now. So.
Absolutely. I think some of us had alluded to it before, but clearly we're trying to figure things out amid COVID. Things have rapidly moved online. We're trying to figure out blended, but it seems like there might have already been, whether it's private schools or homeschools, best practices already in place. So I'm curious, from your perspectives, what are some best practices that you've seen with your school partners or in your personal life to ease this transition, but also might be good best practices in the future that other people can learn from? Because quite frankly, I'm excited this panel is actually reaching a global audience.
So personally, I don't know. I mean, I think in terms of best practices, especially in the high school where my kids go to, I don't haven't seen them kind of really nailing it down in terms of trying to figure it out. I think it's still a lot of trial and error. And even with the students, I mean, you see them engaged in things like that. Like I said previously, they're kind of distracted. I haven't really seen them being able to kind of nail it down. I mean, even from my perspective, teaching online, I mean, sometimes when I teach online, it's the most boring thing because I don't know whether the students are listening or whether they're doing something else. And once in a while, I ask a question and then nobody responds, right? So it's like, okay, all of you are doing something else. So I don't know. I mean, without the camera turned on, it's probably a little more difficult to keep that attention going. So I think that's something that still needs to be figured out. That's why with your startups, so hopefully you can figure that out here pretty quickly. So.
I've had a great experience over the last 2.5 weeks launching Broward schools, and mainly in the middle and elementary school level. And it's really been, given the tool set that we have, they're very much into positive affirmations and giving shout outs and wins. We've been able to program principal automated shout outs for students on their birthday that automatically go out, but we customize it. So the principals have been making their own GIFs. We've been uploading them and putting them into the system. So there's been it's been very well received, the social emotional learning, the how do we make the kids belong and feel safe. And all the teachers really care about their students, right? And so, the problem is they can't connect with them as well. They can't be there to comfort them, hug them, support them on a face-to-face level, which is what teachers love to do. So we found that by holding these after-school activities and really pushing the positivity, everyone's smiling a lot. Even though they're on a screen with 30 other people, they're all smiling at the same time, and they're doing things back and forth with each other. So they have that social cognition going on, even though there's a screen there. And that leads to, that's really what leads to emotional maturity, which is what they want. But it also gets their attention. So we've been telling the teachers at the end of the class, and with a shout out, so everyone does it. And so you're always ending on a high note. So we're trying, and they've set up contests between the students for the first few weeks to get them involved. We've set up online assemblies and prizes and dances and everything like that, so that the students are motivated and they're focused on doing group activities as they move back into an academic learning environment that happens to be online.
What I've been noticing is that I think there are going to be some schools that need a huge reality check about what it's like on the student side. So there's some schools out there that have all these rules around, you're not allowed to eat while you're on Zoom. You're not allowed to sit on your bed. There shouldn't be other people in the room with you, or you need to be wearing certain kinds of clothes. I mean, clothes full stop are a good idea, but they get kind of strict about what kind of clothes and
no pajama bottom.
But it makes so many assumptions about what kind of resources people have at home, and what their life circumstances are, how available their parents can be to be overseeing these sorts of things. So I think over time there'll be some best practices on the school side as well about what we can and shouldn't expect from students on the other side of the screen.
Yep, definitely. I think there's an etiquette side to this, and I think there's also a software side on figuring out what software do we use to allow virtual schooling to come feel almost as if I'm in school. what is like the suite of tools that I need beyond just video conferencing? Like, do I need distraction elimination? What kind of classroom engagement tools do I need to feel like it is a more seamless experience where I don't feel as isolated, as they said?
Yeah.
I think that's a big important part of it.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Jeff, I know that we've had conversations beyond this too, and I think you said something that sticks with me, that a lot of times, especially in public education, a lot of our kids get their meals at school, right? And so
Yeah.
if they're at home, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing is, and we have hundreds of kids up at a time, we see that 60 or 70% have their screens off, and mostly in these inner city schools or Title I schools. And it's because they're ashamed, right? And you don't want to create more identity threat, especially at the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade level. It's hard enough. You're trying to establish who you are. And if you come from a family that has less, it's harder. You feel that because you're always comparing yourself. So that's going on. And then we've seen the lines that have just gone up drastically at every school in New York City in terms of giving food out for breakfast, for lunch, over the weekend. There a good percentage of these students are now either homeless or working poor in New York City. These are very, very tight times. And we talked about having devices earlier. Our principals are giving them out. They all have the devices, but the kids are selling the devices because the family needs food. So it's not an ideal situation. We need to lick COVID and get back to a situation because those who have least need the most. They need that safe learning environment. And if you won't turn on your screen, it means you're not in a safe place, or you're not in a comfortable place, or a place where you can concentrate. But at least at school, if you can make a good connection with a group of kids or a teacher, and you can find that safe space, you can learn despite how tough your environment is where you're growing up. So that is why that group of students are the ones that are going to lose the most if this continues for a long period of time.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why positivity matters. And so positive affirmation absolutely means a lot, as much as we can with video chat. So, we've talked about some of the struggles with this transition. We've talked about, best practices still emerging and will continue to emerge. And it's still probably a little too early to have a suite of best practices, but that should also probably include not only the technology side, but the social emotional learning side, things that happen at home and outside of physical school walls that become more relevant. But I'm curious now, even though we're rapidly moving to online learning, what are some of the promises of this rapid movement to online learning, even if we're still trying to figure it out right now?
I think students will be able to specialize more ultimately as they master this skill set and learning from home. I think students can learn to teach themselves faster out of necessity. And kind of once you establish that level of maturity, confidence, and risk-taking in your education, then it's about finding out what you like and really going in that direction. And so I think there's a great opportunity for students to now learn a lot more than they would in a more structured classroom.
One of the things that you also tend to see a little bit on that is the use of textbooks, right? So, typically here, even my kids, they had to go pick up a couple of textbooks. But one of the things that you're starting to see is that rather than push the kids towards the textbook, now they're kind of saying, hey, go watch this video or go do this. And they're kind of pushing the kids to more of that interactive screen learning type of thing with video or listening to something, as opposed to looking at a textbook and trying to figure out a problem there, right? So personally, I'm not a big fan of textbooks, right, and the way they're structured, but kids are literally forced to use it. So you're also kind of seeing different learning patterns in terms of getting them a little bit more involved and making some of the learning a little bit more visual with kind of real life experiences and case studies and things like that. So,
Anna, I know that you're working with a specific group of students too. Do you see this rapid movement to online learning impacting the way that your students are working?
Yeah, I love the fact that so much learning now is self-guided and self-paced. That was already in process before COVID, but I hope it sticks because I think that's a huge benefit for students.
Absolutely. And Maxwell, are you hearing any thoughts from your families and schools that you're working with on the promise of online learning amidst all of this?
I have not heard anything about the promise yet, but my guess would be that since people are now forced to be, using these digitally enabled tools and data is becoming more and more accessible, the more that they use it, I'm hoping that there will be more data insights into understandings of SEL, social emotional learning, equity data, and just figuring out how to bridge those gaps between different learners and different socioeconomic backgrounds.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very real. I mean, I will say that my son starts school next week, and I haven't read as much about his school information until this year because I have to, right? Like I have to sit next to him. And so I think one of the, maybe as a parent, maybe where I haven't been as intimately involved in his education, I am now forced to, and that itself might be a gift. All right, well, thank you so much for your perspective so far. I have one more question left, and that is, given all that's happening now, from your perspectives, what are investment trends towards online and remote education startups, and given our needs right now, especially amid COVID?
From an investment standpoint, I mean, the good thing about, and I'm not sure I understand this, the stock market is obviously going crazy, right? So the money is flowing from that standpoint. But from an investment perspective, you're starting to see a little bit more money into more growth type companies, kind of Series A, Series B, as opposed to seed investments. For seed investments, I think it's kind of at least in what I'm seeing, there's a little bit more hesitancy in kind of like, is this the right direction? Should we put money in? Should we wait a little bit more till things settle down? So I'm not seeing actually even speaking to people, I'm not seeing a lot of, there's a fear in terms of more of the seed investments, because I think they are looking for a lot more validation. Even we talked to an angel investor yesterday, and he sent this whole message this morning going, you know what, I really need to see some validation and see some users on your system before we would consider it. So you're starting to see a little bit more people wanting to see a lot more traction, as opposed to kind of this money putting in at the idea stage or a little bit more down the line, even with a MVP from that standpoint.
Yeah, I would say that the traditional sales process is disrupted because it's really through relationships and conventions, especially in terms of public education. And so that network right now is kind of shut down, and it's very hard to access that network, that combined with budgets. And from an investor's perspective, they love platforms right now because platforms are all the rage, because they're seeing the values of platforms go up and they see it as the future. So if you can position yourself as a platform that can last and can generate revenue, and if you have revenue and you're continuing to make revenue in this market, then they're very interested. Because if this is the hardest of times, which I think it is for a while anyway, and hopefully for our lives, if you can make it now, then you'll make it the rest of the way. But it's easy to sit. I agree with what Manoj said, that seed investors, pre-revenue type things, not happening unless you have incredible research behind it and you've come up with a new vaccine or something. Then they're all in book.
Absolutely.
Definitely agree. It seems that certain milestones of revenue has become the new standard for seed rounds. For the most part, I mean, you can find pre-seed investors, although that is extremely rare. If you're looking for those earlier stage investments, then you're probably best off going to accelerators. But yeah, COVID, I think, definitely has made EdTech a super hot topic in terms of investments. However, I don't see an increase in deals at early stages. It's more just doubling down on what's working now, proven through revenues.
I think there's going to be a lot more bootstrapping than we were perhaps expecting across the board.
Especially in the midst of COVID. And I see what happening not only in the investment industry, but just personally. People are saving more these days. So yeah, those were the questions that I had initially. But as we wrap up this panel, I know that there's a lot of expertise here from different perspectives in the industry. I don't know if you have a final thought to leave our audience with as we end this panel. So I guess if we could start off with you, Jeff, since you kicked off this panel with the introduction, and then we'll go to everyone else for final thoughts.
Well, I believe in Maslow before Bloom, and I believe in connectedness in order for, and feeling safe in order to learn. So measuring that, which is what was brought up by Manoj and others, is really hard to do. And I actually think that Maxwell brought it up because we've been working with several districts and we're like, well, how do you want us to measure the impact on a social emotional learning scale? And they say, well, we have our own measures, and we ask for them and they don't produce them because they don't really exist. And then at the end of the day, we come up with all sorts of different measures. So having soft measures that are both subjective and objective around social emotional learning is kind of where our focus is. And we think it'll add a great deal of value because you'll know if the student's upset or if they're happy. And it's kind of that easy. If they're happy, they're going to learn. If they're upset, it's going to be a tougher road to hoe.
Absolutely. Anna, do you have any?
No, I mean, that's just a good reminder that, you know, in ed tech of various stripes, you know, sometimes your immediate goal is to make the student's life easier, the teacher's life easier, or the administrator's life easier. At the end of the day, though, we all have to be ruthlessly student focused, particularly now.
Absolutely. And Maxwell, as you're talking to more schools, do you have any final thoughts on online remote learning?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess as COVID started to really impact schools and they were trying to figure everything out, something that I was hearing a lot was the term the new normal. And I think that, you know, although COVID will eventually, you know, not necessarily go away, but, you know, the vaccines will come out and, you know, things will start more becoming normal. I think that elements of what's happening with school today with remote learning and blended learning are here to stay, even when it comes to the pod schools or the homeschooling. So I definitely think that it's for the best in terms of forcing education to become much more digitally enabled and making sure that they innovate more than they ever have.
And Manoj, with your own EdTech venture, as well as being a fellow parent, do you have any final thoughts on the future or the current state of online remote education?
You know, the one thing I will say is if you take a look at, you know, when you ever bring up an idea with an investor, they'll say, oh, forget it. If you're trying to sell to a school district, that's never going to happen, right? So they wouldn't never put money into you. But one of the things that you're starting to see right now is schools are forced to adopt a technology, right? They have to use it whether they like it or not. Not only that, they are even forced to adopt to new learning methods and new ways of teaching students, right? So to an extent, in the last 6 months, they have accelerated technology adaptation in just, I mean, it's gone leaps and bounds in terms of the way schools are doing it. So that's been a positive, and they are literally forced to change as opposed to sticking to the old traditional methods of those massive textbooks and kids carrying 40 pounds on their backs, right, of textbooks. So that's forced them to change from that standpoint. So then that in some ways has been a huge positive in seeing some of the changes being made right now in that environment. So
yeah, absolutely.
maybe the investors will put money into companies that sell to school districts.
It's the future. It's the new normal, as Maxwell said. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for being a part of this panel, making time out of your busy day personally and professionally. And thank you so much for being a part of this panel and the Newchip Accelerator program events. So thank you so much.
Thank you.